Thanks to everybody who's joined so far. We're just going to give it a few more minutes, let the room fill up. We'll probably start about 3 or 4 minutes past. Numbers are still growing up, so we'll just give it a couple more minutes and then we'll kick off. Okay, we're at 4 minutes past, so we'll kick off. I'm going to move into some introductions and a bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get the session started. So you can see on the screen here some points of contact for you from today. So welcome, first of all, to the next instalment of the Sage Intacct Function Focus webinar. I am really excited to introduce this one today. It's aimed at simplifying subscription and recurring billing. For those of you I haven't met before, my name's Laura Lee, and I'm an account manager for Sage Intacct UKI customers. Myself and Gary Preston make up the account management team, and we would work closely alongside your customer success managers. We're also pleased to welcome today customers not only supported by Sage Direct, but also our business partners. So if you are supported by your partner, please reach out to your usual point of contact should you need anything following this session. I'll soon be handing over to the lovely Marvin Rogers, who might be a familiar face to some businesses who have looked at subscription billing in the past. And I'll just jump into some housekeeping next. So we will be pausing throughout the demonstration to answer questions. So please feel free to put questions into the questions box. And as I say, we'll pause at some sections throughout. If we don't manage to get to the questions, we will have a good 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a dedicated question and answer point. Please look out for the survey right at the very end of the webinar. It's really important that we get feedback. We listen to your requests for future webinars, and you can also request to speak to somebody about your business requirements following the session. All the content, as with previous webinars, is posted into the community. So there will be an option at the end to request some help registering for the community. And if you're already a member there, you can go to the Function Focus group and look for this content and previous content. And finally, enjoy the webinar and please ask questions. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to you now, Marvin.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laura. Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's Sage Intacct function focused webinar. We're going to be focusing today on automating the quote to cash process. And within that, we're going to be focusing primarily within on the contracts module itself. As Laura mentioned, and for those I haven't met, my name is Marvin, and I'm the lead solution consultant for the software vertical, which is typically engages with organizations like yourselves that have either subscriptions or software related pains related to billing and revenue recognition, which will form the basis of the conversation today. Again, one thing to sort of reiterate before we get into the functionality and the components of today's session is to really I want to remind and encourage you to use the Q&A function to post any questions throughout. I will try to pause at various different components, but please do feel free to ask us any questions, and we'll be sure to, if not within the session, get back to you as soon as possible. The focus of today's session, as I mentioned, is really about allowing how Sage Intacct can allow you to be able to bill your customers as quickly and as easy as possible. But beyond that, also track and really monitor the right customer journey that's going to provide your subscriptions with as much visibility internally, but also provide your customers as much flexibility in how they engage with you. In terms of an overview, what we'll do is start by just talking a little bit around subscriptions in general and some of the challenges that can exist with them, and particularly why Sage Intacct is considered a leader within that particular space. We'll then, for the majority of the session, be focused on a demonstration of the Sage Intacct solution, taking you through from a quote, which in today will be leveraging the integration with Salesforce, but it's also worth bearing in mind that Sage Intacct can be enabled to integrate with any API-enabled CRM application. So for the likes of HubSpot or any other applications that you may be using. We'll then touch on the core, for what will be the majority of the session, the core functionality around the contracts in relation to the billing, the subscription, revenue recognition, alongside the reporting that comes out of the system as standard. So for those unfamiliar with Sage Intacct within the subscription space, so in addition to being a leader in the cloud financial space, Sage Intacct is also a leader in the subscription billing space, and it's in fact the only solution that is marked as a leader in both of these spaces. And the way in which it's able to do so is by not only having functionality that is built to define a quote to cash process that's going to suit a number of different billing methods, revenue recognition methods, and even subscription engagement methods, but it's also leveraging its open APIs that got the ability to interact with a number of different applications, either using our marketplace or through any custom integrations to leverage information coming through at various points within the customer journey, whether it's bringing information from the CRM that you see Salesforce today in particular, or interacting with payment or banks, or in fact other solutions to drive further information along your Q2C process. So I mentioned that Sage Intacct is considered a leader within the subscription billing and financial space. But why exactly is that? So first and foremost, amongst other review sites, Sage Intacct G2 in particular has marked Sage Intacct as a leader across 3 of its key areas in relation to this piece. These include accounting, which you'd expect being a cloud financial solution. It also includes subscription billing, which is related to managing the recurring billing process, but also being able to provide a plethora of billing methods and automating that Q2C cycle. In addition, there was a subscription revenue management grid, which is intended to drive compliance and governance around the revenue recognition process. Now, we'll put a few links in the chat, in the Q&A function and the chat function of this webinar to actually have a look at these review sites. But the purpose of G2 is, unlike other analyst-driven sites, it's actually based on peer reviews. So billing, revenue, and finance operation leaders like yourselves have used a number of different systems and marked it from a combination of time to implement, user friendliness, and just general ability to and functionality. And on that basis, they've defined 3 grids, and these grids across a number of different solutions, but they provide 3 grids that give you a view of where Sage Intacct sits. So if we look at the subscription billing grid, you can see it's marked as the leader alongside what you would typically consider as point subscription billing tools. This when filtered for the mid-market space. Equally, from a subscription revenue management perspective, again, Sage Intacct is found as a leader amongst those point tools that you would expect in that particular space as well. So why exactly is Sage Intacct considered the leader? Well, it's the only cloud financials tool to be marked as a leader in not just the accounting, but the subscription billing and the subscription revenue management area. And the reason why it's marked as this leader is because it addresses some of the core challenges that subscription organizations face. Typically, one of the key challenges that exist is communication silos that may exist from having multiple different applications to run different cycles within the customer engagement. So from the pipeline process right through to collecting cash and recognizing revenue, there are a number of different conversations that are often happening in siloed systems, often information being entered in multiple systems multiple times to get that level of detail, leading to a duplication of effort, which is slowing down the time that it would take to get an invoice out. In addition to having these disparate systems and poor communications, unsurprisingly, this drives poor reporting governance, not just from an audit perspective, but also from a business insight perspective. So how does Sage Intacct address this? Well, Sage Intacct's contract module effectively looks to do exactly that. By leveraging its bidirectional integration with CRM, so in this case, Salesforce, we're able to break down some of those communication silos that may exist between the handover points between sales and finance, but also provide information back to sales to close the loop on some of those downstream financial transactions. So for example, invoices and payments that may occur later down the customer journey cycle. Equally, by having that integrated and unified approach, we're able to streamline and reduce and mitigate any duplication of effort that may exist, and ensure that information is moved through and passed with the relevant approvals to ensure a bill is sent out to the customer on time. And then finally, the reporting, both from a GAAP and from a SaaS perspective, when we look at revenue, when we look at billing, we're able to get a view of not only the amount, or not only our financial statements, but also the health of customers and actually drive insightful decisions as well. So let's take a look at some of this in action. As I mentioned, by way of an agenda today, I'm going to start by covering that quote to cash process, and then driving into the more, for the meat of the session, the contract module, which will cover the subscription billing, revenue, and all the subscription operations that occur. Another reminder to please send any questions through the Q&A function at any point in the session. So let's take a look at this in action. So you should be hopefully seeing my browser screen now with logged into Sage Intacct. You may, as customers of system, you may be familiar with the concept of dashboards that permeate the system and provide us the ability to view information across different sources. So here on my CFO dashboard, I'm looking at strategic information across my entire organization that is being reflected in KPIs that you see at the top, which are based on account groups, which can be defined to track the necessary metrics that I need based on balances that exist either in my financial account or in my statistical account, or a combination of the two to provide the necessary computations. I've also got the ability to report an information across my dimensions, so I can look at the same figure. So for example, the £300,000 figure across a multitude of different lenses, whether I want to do it based on customers in a certain region, customers in a certain industry, the type of or source of revenue I'm dealing with, or even the service or product I'm providing. I'm able to look at information and sharpen my focus around the particular lens that is relevant to my particular query at that moment in time. Equally, I've got the ability to interrogate information. So as you may be familiar, I can drill into reports and charts and see the underlying data and interrogate the information beyond the insight that I'm seeing. One of the key advantages of Sage Intacct's subscription functionality is that I'm able to look at the same transaction or the same contract or the same agreement through a variety of different lenses, depending on what my focus is. So if we think of a simple subscription that may have at some point a component of an invoice that's related to it, it may have a component of revenue that's related to it, or it may have component of metrics that are being driven, the non-GAAP metrics that are being driven to drive a SaaS picture. Provided on my role or my level of interest, I can access the contract off the back of the invoice, off the back of a journal posting in relation to the GAAP revenue that's been posted, or I can drive in from the SaaS metrics that are being captured adjacent to these GAAP postings as well. Drilling into that particular report for that particular time period then takes me through to my general ledger, which shows the subset of transactions that are making up that particular area I've queried. So in this case, a particular quarter within a particular subset of GL accounts. Drilling further into the transaction, I'm then able to see the individual transaction that gave rise to this. So this should be hopefully should be very familiar to you, the idea of seeing the transaction and any communication that may have come through with that transaction by leveraging the collaborate function, which can also be integrated with Salesforce Chatter to provide and break down some of those communication silos that may exist. As you may be aware, on the transaction level of Sage Intacct, we're also able to view the necessary dimensions that are related to that transaction. So in this case, on this particular journal entry that's posting to a particular book, which in this case is my SaaS book, I'm able to see that it's related to a certain source of revenue that is related to a particular customer, employee, item, and even the contract. And it's this contract record, which serves as a dimension that really drives a lot of the operations in relation to this particular agreement with a customer. Now, given that we looked at a particular posting on a particular month as part of this contract, I'm able to now, when I drill into the contract, get a wider picture. So rather than looking at the £1,000, which relates to 1 month's equivalent of recurring revenue for this particular contract, I'm now able to look at the subscription as a whole by leveraging the contract record to see that not only is that £12,000 split up across £1,000 transposed across 12 months, but I'm also able to see that in addition to selling a recurring component, this subscription also had some additional components. Initially, an implementation fee, which is defined as a one-time fee, and an additional midterm change that occurred at some point within the contract lifecycle, which denoted with a necessary change type. So from a reporting perspective, I can isolate the difference from a recurring revenue perspective as to what was generated in the initial instance and what was carried on as an upsell or a midterm change as well. Critically, the contract record isolates billing and revenue so they can form their own tracks to provide you the flexibility to invoice and recognize revenue in whatever format makes most sense, depending on the potential performance obligation you're trying to define. So in this case, if I look at the recurring component, I can see that my billing has been billed up front. However, when I look to revenue, we'll see that that revenue has actually been broken down on a straight line period, accounting for the start and end dates of that particular contract as well. So on a single line by line basis, I'm able to define how I want to invoice and how I want to recognize. And that can be driven based on time frames. It can be driven based on, in this case, for example, my implementation, maybe rather than being driven solely on a time base, I could also drive that on the basis of delivery of a project or milestones within a particular project as well. So I've got the ability to look at each component of a subscription independently and get a view and determine the necessary treatment from a revenue perspective as well as from a billing perspective. Looking more holistically at the contract, I'm also able to look at any necessary postings that are happening in conjunction with my GAAP postings in relation to the SaaS movements. So for example, we drilled into this because of the initial posting that determined that this was an increase in the balance of what I had as new monthly recurring revenue, which was then subsequently updated at some point within the term of the contract when my add-on item was captured. Now that journal that is being captured there is essentially the journal that gave rise to our search that started right at the front of our dashboard as well. So I've got the referential integrity to dive and interrogate information in whichever way makes most sense. One crucial component of the contract is that at any point it's possible to determine exactly the nature of revenue and invoicing limited to the individual components of those. So as we start at the beginning of our contract, we expect everything to be sitting in a book state, so a non-posted state that is, or non-balance sheet, a balance sheet neutral state that is going to capture that I have a component of revenue that I need to recognize and a component of invoicing I need to recognize over the course of the life cycle. As we looked at invoice, we move on the right side, right through to payment. And as we recognize, the components are moved down, which means at any point, I've got the ability to see what sits in deferred, accrued, recognized, and even paid revenue. I can also sharpen my focus to a particular period. So for example, if we look at the beginning of this particular subscription, I can see how the revenue profile has changed over the time. So if I drill in month on month, you'll see that while we initially started with a particular booked amount, which unsurprisingly made up of our recurring subscription alongside our implementation fee, I'm able to see crucially how that total amount is split out across what's been invoiced, what's been recognized on that basis as well. I'm also able to do this on an independent line by line basis. So each line has its own overview of exactly where billing and revenue sit, when they meet, and the necessary, at any point in time, the necessary amounts that sit in those balances. I can do this not just across revenue, but any related expenses that I have to the contract. Say, for example, if as part of delivering this particular contract, I needed to pay a commission to a sales rep or a platform fee or something that was intrinsically tied to delivery of this contract, I'm also able to push that information to the balance sheet and spread that. Just like I can on the revenue recognition, I can amortize that over time on that basis. Again, in both instances, I always have the access to the general ledger journal that was sent. So I've always got the referential integrity to drill into the level of detail and see the nature of that transaction. Following on the subscription lifecycle over time, as this subscription then gets renewed and follows renewals, I've got the ability to not only automate the renewal, first by leveraging renewal templates. So for example, in this case, a template that introduces an uplift of 5% to be driven by the system, but I can also crucially drive renewals from opportunities within Salesforce. So I've got the flexibility to define exactly the level of information that I need to capture at any moment in time. And then for those dealing in selling bundles and reporting in IFRS 15, it's also possible to set up in conjunction with a billing price list. It's also possible to set up fair value price list so that the necessary allocations can be made to ensure that the gap revenue is compliant with IFRS 15. All this can be accessed from the transaction record related to the dimension of that particular transaction, which I could have drilled into from the dashboard and at any moment in time. And I could have looked at this information for a subset of that information by leveraging my dimensions, whether I've broken my customers into cohorts or broken them into regions or departments or even segments of business that I operate in. So regardless of how I run operationally, I've always got the view to drill into the level of detail and see the insight that follows. Now, in a moment, I'm going to walk through the end-to-end quote-to-cash cycle for how we take an opportunity right from pipeline right through to collecting cash and recognizing revenue, and even the reporting that sits on there. Before I do so, I'm just going to pause for a couple of seconds just to see if we've got any questions that we can address.
Hi, Marvin. Yeah, there's one question from Christopher Bowen. He is asking, what modules do the contract and recurring invoicing require?
Sure, great question. So the modules in particular, from a contract perspective, or the base modules, are the contract billing and the contract revenue recognition, of which with the latter of which there are two components. There's the advanced component that really kicks in if you are dealing with multi-element arrangements and you've got fair value allocations and some complexities around how you recognize and allocate revenue, or the standard revenue recognition module, which covers the ability to have independent billing and revenue treatments that are driven based on the billing price list. In addition to this, there are some additional modules that can provide capability in relation to usage. So one of the components we'll see today is the ability to have tiered and usage-based billing models, which can also introduce the usage billing module alongside the advanced CRM connector. So for example, if connecting with Salesforce, it's possible. While this contract module works in isolation, it is also possible to integrate that with Salesforce, in which case the advanced CRM module may be applicable. And then, as you saw just briefly at the end there, contract expense management, so the ability to, in addition to managing the revenue operations, being able to amortize expenses over the course of the license period of that contract. There is some of the reporting you've seen so far is part of account groups that are driven within the system, but it is also possible to drive that reporting either in Sage Intacct, leveraging our digital board book, or by running that reporting externally by taking the information out of the system. Very long response, but hopefully that's answered your questions. Please do let me know if there are any follow-ups to that as well.
I'll have to probably watch this back. Oh, sorry, watch it back and listen to it back to enter the answer to that one when I finish, Marvin. Thank you. There's one from Joshua Cole. Regarding renewals, you mentioned it can handle a percentage uplift. Could Sage look up RPI on a website, for example, and perform calculation to create an uplift?
So as standard, the uplift is entered by the user. So it's user enabled. However, it is possible by leveraging a customization to read and source that information and update that in the system. So it is functionally possible, but as standard, this is typically user entered.
Perfect, thank you. That's it so far, nothing else on there, Marvin.
Fantastic, awesome. So let's take a look at the quote to cash process, because I appreciate that while you may be using the system and you may be using some of these components, some of the terminology that I'm probably going to be used today is maybe new or alien to you. So just to congregate on functionality, I just want to touch about some of the few things within from a quote to cash process that you're going to see today. So firstly, you're going to see the advanced CRM connector in action, which is effectively the way in which we break down the silos that may exist between sales and finance. Now, while you're seeing Salesforce today, which is our native bi-directional integration, it is worth bearing in mind that an integration of this scope can be applied to any API-enabled CRM solution. So, and we've worked with the likes of HubSpot, we've worked with the likes of Dynamics and other CRM solutions that exist as well. But in terms of this Salesforce integration, it effectively works by integrating the common objects between the two. So for example, accounts and customers, and it's possible to define which directions the integration is driven, what the source is, and what the nature of it, whether it's one way or two way. So we've got our accounts and our customers integrate, our contacts integrate, the ability to integrate products and price books to our price list and items if relevant, and then the ability to drive, crucially, that downstream financial information back into the CRM. So both from an invoice perspective, but also from any related dimensions that are being captured on that basis. Now, the purpose of this is to not only ensure that both teams have access to the full-blown picture of that subscription for that particular customer, but it also ensures there is actually a communication method by leveraging that collaborate component to interact between the two systems as well. Once that connector has been in play, what that then allows us to do is to seamlessly pass information from opportunity or pipeline right through to close of contract. So ordinarily, what is done is at a point of which an opportunity is closed won, a contract is raised within Salesforce. Now, the purpose of this object, which is optional, is defined to congregate multiple opportunities together. It really sets the framework for some of those midterms, as the midterm may be a separate opportunity which is applied to that same contract. And then the contract object is then integrated with Sage Intacct to then provide the downstream automation, both from an invoice perspective and to also provide status of payments of those invoices. So sales living within Salesforce or the CRM can get visibility into who's been invoiced, how much has been invoiced and how much has been paid, while finance get the flexibility of not having to define every single contract because it's being driven off the back, automated off the back of the opportunity being closed won. And this is possible because the items and the products, the accounts and the customers and the relevant objects are synced to provide that level of information. As I mentioned, one of the critical pieces of the contract is that it isolates deliberately the billing and the revenue. So the invoice and the billing and the revenue take separate tracks right from the off. So while I may be invoicing on a straight line or quarterly or monthly basis, I'm able to recognize on the most relevant scenario that is required for that particular performance obligation, whether that's daily, taking into account the fluctuation in days within the months of the year, whether it's straight line, whether it's prorated, or whether it's even driven off an external source like a project delivery or even an activation date. The crucial piece is my ability to recognize revenue is not contingent on how I'm invoicing, which means that I can ensure that I'm mitigating any revenue leakage that may exist. Now, because everything within Sage Intacct, whether we're looking at the revenue posting, the invoice, or the payments, are being reflected on the general ledger in real time, from a reporting perspective, I'm able to see the impact of that. And crucially, as you saw from a dashboard perspective, I'm able to query this particular contract through a number of different lenses. I can look at this contract in the context of either a SaaS or GAAP related revenue posting that's hit the general ledger. I can look at that contract in the context of a payment record that's come through, that's hit a bank GL account, or I can look at it in the context of my AR. So I've always got the ability to have different sources to do so. And in conjunction with these operations that are happening from a financial perspective, I'm also able to effectively capture SaaS metrics that are going to define where that particular subscription has moved through. So let's take a look at that, an example of that. So I may have a subscription that begins life as an opportunity with a component of recurring, with a recurring component as well as a services or one-time component. As that's closed won, I may choose to raise a contract off the back of that, which is then used to create a contract within Sage Intacct. And then at which point Sage Intacct, on an individual line-by-line basis, as you've seen, would be able to define what is going to be invoiced, what is going to be recognized, and push that to general ledger. Because each line has its own treatment, I can also look at not just what is sitting within my invoiced amount and my recognized amount, but I can also see any accrued and any deferred positions on that basis as well. Critically, I can pass that information back into the CRM or Salesforce to then share that downstream information in relation to invoice and payment. At some point, the system is also going to define, based on those logical movements, some additions and balances to the necessary SaaS metrics account. So if this is a new contract with a new customer, then it knows to update my customer account, tag to that particular customer in a journal. It's also able to reflect my new monthly recurring revenue figure and potentially my CAC, my customer acquisition cost rate on that particular basis as well. At some point when we anticipate a midterm, again, it follows its own structure and has its own billing and revenue treatment, and that information can be passed back into the CRM, as well as any related metrics that come onto that, whether that's defining that it's expansion or add-on related monthly recurring revenue, or even the subsequent renewal or upgrade and uplift that comes at the end of the contract lifecycle. So let's take a look at that in action. So the journey starts within the CRM. So in this case, I'm looking within Salesforce and I'm looking specifically at an opportunity record that contains a recurring and a one-time fee. Those have been defined with the necessary prices, again, integrating the two different objects that exist, or corresponding objects that exist within the system. As I mentioned, once that opportunity is closed won, we're able to raise a contract to effectively hoover up multiple opportunities that are related to this agreement or this financial arrangement with this customer. So here we see the initial opportunity we started with, and even a midterm that occurs 6 months later, ready to be integrated and activated as part of the contract. At any point, I can sync that to Sage Intacct, and what that would do is create effectively a contract record within Sage Intacct, which is going to reflect the necessary positions for this contract and provide a go-between to interface with. So when I look from a Sage Intacct perspective, what I expect to see is my contract with a particular contract ID that is going to have this corresponding contract information. Jumping into Sage Intacct and querying my list of contracts, I know that I'm going to have a contract with a particular contract ID that reflects that particular transaction itself. Whereas my transaction had started with 2 separate opportunities in Salesforce that were tied together with a contract, my contract record congregates this information. So I can see my recurring components, and I can define individual item descriptions that will then show up in future invoices. And I've also got the ability to drive any associated additions to that contract over the life cycle of that contract. So in this case, a midterm addition that was added 7 months post the start of the particular contract. Still co-terminating and providing me the ability to manage a renewal with an uplift across the entire contract value for the lines that I deem renewable, which can be defined on an individual line-by-line basis. Within the contract, I'm able to define not just the billing schedule. So in this case, I've opted to follow a quarterly billing schedule for my recurring components, but I'm able to crucially have a separate revenue recognition schedule on that basis. I can choose to change at this point the revenue recognition schedule. So in this case, rather than having a straight line spread of my £12,000, which is prorating given the contract start date, so a third into the month, I can decide to follow a daily recognition, which may have a slightly more lumpy approach given the fluctuations in a number of days within each month of that particular contract. Saving that will allow the contract revenue recognition to be effectively reflected to show, for example, February being a shorter month, reflecting the number of days on that basis. Still looking at the same contract or discounted sales amount that we're dealing with at that point. Now, the critical piece here is that these are schedules that are then going to be triggered to be delivered either automatically or on batch, either individually or on batch, and either automatically or as a review process, depending on what my operation is. Additionally, my implementation can follow, so in this case, a straight line method of or an upfront method of billing, but I can choose to follow either an upfront or a straight line method of revenue recognition, depending on what the nature of my particular performance obligation is or how I wish to drive that particular element. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have the component of usage. So in this case, I've got a midterm addition that is actually related to a usage-based item. And what this allows me to do is to have either a variable component or actually a hybrid of fixed and variable. So in this case, I may decide to define my usage based on quantity. So I may decide to recognize based on quantity that's been delivered, but actually decide to bill based on a separate quantity on that basis. So I can define exactly how I want this to be treated over the life cycle of that particular subscription. So now what I expect by moving this to quantity-based billing is that the amount that is going to be invoiced to the customer is going to be the fixed amount in addition with any usage that customer consumes. So in this case, however many data services they consume above and beyond their included unit. And that information is defined on a price list entry, and where I can define, so in this case, the customer gets 100 included unit at a rate of £3,000, which gives me a rate of £30 per unit, above which the customer then falls into different pricing plans where usage is going to be contingent on where the price is going to be contingent on the amount they consume. So I'm supporting a number of different billing methods in addition to different revenue method treatment for that particular component. If I decided to add usage to this particular component, say for example, for the first and second month, I'm able to the system is able to define which components of the usage. So in this case, I added 75 and then 50. The 75 being included within the initial 100 was treated as revenue. And then of the 50, the system identified that 25 was going to be free of charge and still marked as revenue. And the additional 25 was then going to be charged at whatever that variable rate that I'm dealing with is going to be. When it comes to invoicing these components, I'm able to effectively drive that from the system, either en masse or for an individual invoice. So say, for example, we start with the beginning or with our first component of that particular subscription. What I expect for the month, in the month of January, what I expect to invoice is £3,000 for my initial subscription and the £4,500 for my implementation piece. I can do this across all transactions. So previewing this, we'll look at every line on every transaction and query every billing rule that is associated to that in order to give me that level of detail. Or I can look at it or filter to an individual contract, or even create invoice policies that can group up my contracts into particular invoicing runs. In this case, rather than creating en masse all of those invoices, I'm going to filter just to show the particular contract that I want to see. And as you can see, I can filter by a lot of those dimensions that exist there. So here, what we expect to see is that invoice amount from our first month's installment alongside our entire upfront piece. So here, unsurprisingly, our £7,500 is ready to be invoiced. Generating that invoice not only provides the record on my accounts receivable, but it's also going to, subject to any approvals that I may have, but it's also going to serve as a record on my contract. So looking at my particular contract, I'll be able to see that that particular component has been billed and invoice 1125 has been created to capture those two elements with the appropriate tax. Equally, jumping back into Salesforce, looking at the version of my contract within Salesforce, what I'll be able to see is I should have now an invoice, that invoice 1125, which is now being reflected based on that particular transaction. So the information is being passed not just upstream, but also being presented back downstream to provide that level of flexibility. And then equally, if I fast forward into the months that we anticipate our particular usage items, and in this case, I'll isolate the usage item and I'll focus on the particular usage item that I'm dealing with. We'll see that when I run this search, that I will have an amount that I expect to invoice as of July, which is when this particular component kicks in. And that amount that I need to invoice is calculated based on whatever the flat fee it is, whatever the billing rule is. So in this case, because only 75% has been consumed, or 75% of the total units have been consumed, and that's part of the allowable units, I will have no usage entries on that basis. However, if I then look to run usage for the following month, where we know that we had then got to a point where more than the applicable usage had been defined, we can see that firstly, I've still got the flat fee that I expected that I haven't yet invoiced in July, but I can see that the 25 has now been charged at that 40%, or that 40 unit rate, which is that next tier that falls in once I've exceeded my 100 included units. So the system not only calculates and automates the billing, but also provides the visibility into what has been calculated for internal review as well. In addition to invoicing, I'm also able to manage revenue recognition directly from the system as well. From a revenue recognition perspective, again, just like my invoicing, I can do so on the basis of all my contracts, or I can sharpen my focus to a particular subset of information. So in this case, the contract, the item, or any dimension that I use to segment my business. I can also do so across revenues and expenses. So if I'm capturing expenses, like in the previous contract, I'm able to see what needs to be recognized on that basis. And again, from here, I can effectively run a schedule to post that particular type of revenue. Which means that regardless of what my lens of view is, whether it's billing or revenue, I've got the ability to see that level of detail. Now, what does that information look like from a reporting perspective? Well, in advance of billing, or once I've billed, I'm able to still leverage information, not just across my billing schedules that exist on the individual contract, but I can expand this to reports across my entire contract lifecycle, across my entire customer base. So here, by filtering and looking at my dashboard, I've got a dashboard that's got some reports that are related to all my contracts, and I can see the necessary postings that I need. So I can see the given rise to the quarterly billing that I anticipate to bill. I've got £3,000 for that particular contract that I expect to bill in the subsequent months of the year. From a revenue perspective, I've got the slightly lumpier figure that I expect to see. So initially, we started with a straight line revenue recognition, but of course that was changed at some point within our structure to show a slightly more lumpy view of that revenue over a period of time. So I can now see for that particular contract what I expect to recognize over the life cycle based on the various different months. So that information can be viewed not only on my individual contract lines themselves, on my journal balances, which can also be focused to be driven off the various different contract lines, where I can see what's been booked, what's been accrued, what's been deferred. But I'm also able to view that information across my entire subscription lifecycle, across my entire customer base on that. And I can also filter that to look at information related to any way in which I segment my business, whether that's through dimensions like my revenue class, or even my customer cohorts, or the types of items or subscriptions and services that I'm delivering. I can view that information from a gap related or gap focused level, or I can also view that information from a SaaS metrics perspective. Again, being mindful that the SaaS postings are being driven off the back of the logical changes that I'm making within the contract. So these are not additional postings that need to be made. These are being done automatically based on the logical movements of my contract. I can see that information across different time frames. So for example, if I wanted to view that for the particular period that we're in question, I can filter that, and that's going to show these metrics across a real-time view of these metrics as of that particular moment in time. As I mentioned earlier, the information isn't just there to be viewed, it's also there to be interrogated. So if I then was to interrogate that particular a particular month within that contract, I'd be able to see the level of, so if I looked for this year and I wanted to interrogate a particular month within that view, I'd be able to look at that particular month and drive in and see the detail that sits underneath it as well. So our contract sits in January of 2022. So by selecting January as my filter, I'll then be able to select the set of MRR postings. So if I'm focused on new MRR, which of course my contract has a component of, I'm able to drill in and see that level of detail. And I can see my contract A863 is sitting under that particular component, and drilling into the contract allows me to see the individual transaction, then the dimension. And then on my contract record, I can see the nature of where everything is sitting. So I can see what's been billed to date, which of course is the invoice that we've sent out. Any payments that are associated to that are captured in the system. I can see what's been recognized to date, which of course is the journal that we raised at that moment in time. And that information is shared both back into Salesforce from a billing perspective, but also driven across all of the reports within the system. So from the inception of an opportunity right through to revenue recognition and actually reporting, I'm able to capture where that customer sits, whether it's from a gap perspective where I want to focus on what their accrued or deferred or recognized position is, or my focus is on the SaaS picture, whether I'm dealing with renewal upgrades, downgrades, or midterms. I'm able to get a full end-to-end flow of that particular subscription. And that flow is why Sage Intacct is considered by G2, amongst other review sites, as the #1 tool for mid-market organizations from a cloud and financials and subscription billing perspective. It's firstly that integration with a CRM, in this case you've seen Salesforce, the flexible billing methods that can be applied on an individual line-by-line basis, the ability to automate the process first through integration, but secondly through a scheduled process that can be executed to run in the background or be crucially interrogated to make adjustments, having the ability to reflect changes in legislation like IFRS, or particular ways in which revenue needs to be decoupled from billing to treat separately. And then finally, being able to drive that organic subscription management, whether I'm dealing with midterms or renewals, and the necessary changes or impacts that has on my SaaS metrics is all delivered out of the contracts module. So what does the contracts module give you? Well, in conjunction with CRM, it gives you the ability to actually action subscription insights both from the CRM alongside the financial system. It gives the opportunity to get an invoice out faster, not just by getting the information into the Intacct as quickly as possible, but also automating the processes of billing and revenue. And then finally, the ability to drive insight and be able to report, whether that's reporting at the macro level from a role-based dashboard, or reporting from an operational dashboard that's looking at either forecasting or looking at SaaS-related metrics at any moment in time. So I'll now pause again for any questions you had around the entire presentation before saving time for the Q&A for the last 5 minutes. Are there any questions at this point?
There was one, Marvin,
Sure.
and it's regarding the usage when you're covering that. So a question from Carla is that, can you import usage over a number of customers and or contracts?
Yeah, absolutely. So while I showed the very manual interface of raising the usage record, that information can be supported via both import and indeed API. So if there is a usage system of record that can actually push the aggregated data through, provided the customers, the contract, which are dimensions, and the item line and lines are defined within the upload, whether that's via API or via CSV, that information can be entered, and that is the most logical or most common way in which usage is actually brought into the system.
Perfect, thanks, Marvin. Other than that, that's the only question we have on the chat. So
awesome. Okay, so we'll probably hold for a couple of minutes just to see if any more questions surface before we wrap up with sort of the next steps on this. Just while we wait for any other final questions to pop up, Laura, do you want to just cover the next steps and we can circle back to any questions at the end?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Marvin. Yeah, we just had a few questions coming in just about the recordings. So as part of this, following the end of the session now, there'll be a survey come through, which will also be on the follow-up email. So as I said before, I really do encourage you to fill this in. It'll really help us understand what you want to see and what's working and perhaps what isn't. Community registration. So we have a function focus group within the community. So as a customer, we highly recommend that you join the community first of all, which is a huge wealth of resource, not only just for logging tickets and getting extra help, but lots of other content in there. Once you're into the community, look for the function focus group, and that's where you'll find the recording and all the questions and answers that are completed of this session, but also all the previous ones. We recommend the Lunch and Learn group as well, which is run by our customer success teams, and that's really just about top tips and things like that. And as it shows on here, the next Lunch and Learn session will be on the 15th of June, which is also a webinar, and that's going to be about backlog busters. And then we are looking for some requests for what we're going to show in the June webinar, so feel free just to let us know what sort of things are of interest to you within Intacct, and we'll certainly see if we can get that into a webinar. And aside from that, Marvin, there isn't any new questions come through. So if anybody needs anything, you've got Gary and I as points of contact, or your business partner account managers, just reach out or go into the community and give us a shout on there. But that's everything for now.
Awesome. Well, all that's left to say is thank you very much for taking the time to join the session. I hope you found it useful. Please do reach out if you have any questions, any thoughts, any concerns around it, and through your appropriate channels, and we'll be sure to address them.
Thank you, Marvin. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again.
thanks, Marvin.
Bye.